Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to be here, and a big thank you to the Centre for the invite to deliver the lecture. And before I get going, obviously I have to say huge congratulations to Paul, to Deb and Tanner for producing a fantastic book. I think it's one of the most important areas of research on children and young people that there is at the moment, and I really hope that your book has the impact and the traction on policy that it needs and deserves to have. There's lots and lots of synergy between my research and the work that you've been doing, and I'm going to try and pull out some of those threads and the synergy tonight. So let's begin at the beginning. Say that. The clicker wasn't working, the keyboard is also not working. Let's have a look. There we go, problem averted. So I think it was back in late February, early March, when Paul got in touch to say, could I provide an overview of what I'd be talking about this evening. And I had this slide on my screen in my office. So I was trying to figure out how it is to frame things to be as interesting and useful as possible, when my toddler burst into the room and he pointed at the screen and he said, "Daddy, what's that?" And I said, well, I'm feeling indulgent, these sort of hazards come up now in COVID post, working from home situation, your children burst into your office, but I'm feeling indulgent, and I'm a big fan of it's a quote from, I think, Richard Feynman, who's a theoretical physicist, and he says that if you can't explain your work in simple terms, then you probably don't understand it well enough yourself. And I love that quote for all sorts of different reasons, and I think it was a kind of challenge accepted moment, but I'll give it a go. And so I said to Finn, well, I'm interested, Finn, in why it is that children fight with one another. And I'm using the word children and fight, I'm not using young people, serious violence with injury or knife crimes. I'm trying to use language that's age appropriate. So I'm interested in why children fight with one another. And he immediately fires back to me, bad children fight with one another. Well, spoiler alert, it's not the angle I'm taking this evening. But I think it's a relatively common response that you get from a 3-year-old, and most children would probably say a similar sort of thing. And it made me wonder, where does that come from? Where do children get that kind of reaction from? And I think a lot of it comes from the media they're exposed to. So whether it's the books they read, or the books that you read to children, or the films they watch, the Disney films, Pixar films, cartoons, they're all really good at putting the world into good and bad, and heroes and villains. And that's quite useful in a number of ways. But what they often don't do is get behind the issue of why it is that behaviour is occurring or not. And that reminded me of a question in Paul and Deb and Hannah's book that very much underpins ACEs, and I think it underpins the trauma-informed approach. It's about moving away from the question of what is wrong with you, or what is wrong with your behaviour, to go and look at the question of what happened to you. So it's a shift to looking at the causes of behaviour, so you understand what's happening in the present, so that you can respond effectively in the future. And I think often Disney films, children's books, very, very good at looking at what's wrong with certain behaviour, what's wrong with people, but not so good at looking at what happened to you. And so what I like to do is try and get behind that and talk about, backstories to characters, so you understand what might have happened to these characters. And I'm not a really boring dad. It's not like we're watching Lion King and Uncle Scar comes onto the screen and I hit the pause button and say, whoa, let's try and understand why it is that Uncle Scar is a bad lion. It's not to that extent, but if there is an opportunity to get behind why it is we're seeing that sort of behaviour, I do like to take it. And here's one good example. So hopefully lots of you will recognise this character. This is Sid from Toy Story. Toy Story, an amazing film. If you haven't seen it, definitely should see it. But he's a classic kind of villain, and he engages in some really bad behaviour, right? He breaks toys, he mashes them up, makes hybrid monsters, he torments his poor little sister, and he plans to strap a rocket to Buzz's back and blow him up, right? So bad character. And children recognise this very quickly. They recognise that you shouldn't break toys, you shouldn't blow toys up, you shouldn't torment your sister, and that's really helpful because my son's got a little sister, and so I tell him, don't be like Sid, don't torment your sister, don't break toys, and that's great. But Toy Story never goes near the question of why it is that Sid behaves in the way that he behaves. And so I've created a backstory for Sid, and so whenever you watch Toy Story now, you'll be able to appreciate why it is that Sid behaves in the way he does. So Sid actually, when he goes into school, children are really quite cruel to Sid. I don't know if you can see it very well on that screen, but he's got a big brace and they're a bit cruel about that. They say mean things to him, they exclude him, they're just not nice, and he's having a hard time of it at school. So when he comes home, he's full of sadness and anger and rage, and he takes it out on his toys. And I explain that to Finn, and he gets it. And so if we say, Sid's not a bad child, it's that he's having a really bad time of it in school, and if we can get to grips with that, if we can deal with that, he wouldn't be coming home and breaking his toys, and that's fine. And this is another opportunity now that Finn has burst into my office, pointed at my screen, for me to try and embed that kind of learning. And so I say to Finn, I'm interested in why his children fight with one another, and there are two main things here. One is about feeling valued. This is all about the relationships you have in your life. So I'll pretend I'm talking to him like, I love you very much, Finn, and your mum loves you, and you've got a little sister that loves you, and you go to nursery, you've got all your little pals, you've got a key worker who you've got a great relationship with, and extended family and all that makes you feel relatively secure and content and happy. And that means that you don't come home feeling like you need to lash out, as Sid would. And I think that's important. And as I say that to him, and he's kind of nodding along a little bit. But remember, he doesn't care what's on this screen, right? He hasn't come in for a lecture on mattering, right? He's come in because he wants me to play with him. And so this kind of dress rehearsal is not going well because he's edging towards the door. He wants to get away now. But I'm frustrated because he came in to get my attention, and as often happens in parenting, you get into these weird situations that flip very quickly where you're like, how has this happened? But now I want his attention, right? Because this is my dress rehearsal. And I'm saying to Finn, no, don't you go, because there's another big part of mattering. It's really important. This is all about agentic power, adding value, having goals, being frustrated. And he's off up the stairs. He said to me, I'm going to play, Daddy. And so he's gone, and I've lost him. And I sit back in my chair feeling a bit dejected, because this was my dress rehearsal. It hadn't gone well, In the best will in the world, this was a failed dress rehearsal. But I am someone who is a half full glass of water sort of person. I look for the silver linings, and so low benchmark to beat tonight. If I can beat 20 seconds of attention and convince you of the value of mattering, I'll feel like I've done my job well. But in all seriousness, I do think this concept of mattering is such an important one for understanding violence between children and young people and even adults, that it's still going to play a very central role in this lecture, even if Finn didn't appreciate it at the time. But before we get to why mattering is so important, I want to take a huge step backwards, literally, but mainly metaphorically, about thinking about why it is, or how it is that we can live in a good society. What does it mean to live in a good society? Which is a big question and a difficult one that people have grappled with throughout the ages, across the disciplines. But I think it's worth us trying to do this. I think there's no one answer to it, and I think it can vary by time and culture and place, but we should give it a go to conform. What are we doing here? Some kind of collective understanding of what sort of society we're trying to bring about. And I think the concept of human flourishing is a really, really useful one for that. And in short, good societies are societies that raise human flourishing to the highest levels. Bad societies are ones where human flourishing is low. But it doesn't get us very far, because people want to know, what do you mean by human flourishing? So I think there are three main things to human flourishing. First of all, I think everyone has needs that need to be fulfilled. And most people are probably familiar with things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There are different lists of needs. Hopefully everyone in the audience can recognise that many of these needs mean something to you, probably some more than others. But generally speaking, everyone has needs that need to be fulfilled, and the more they're fulfilled, the better that society is. There's another way of thinking about flourishing, which is about subjective well-being. So people's internal states, how they think and feel about the world, particular aspects of their life or their life as a whole, and whether you have a good sense of meaning or purpose. That's subjective well-being. And then finally, I think there's also something about how people behave or what people do. Often referred to as, virtue ethics or virtuous behaviour, and people recoil a bit at that because it sounds a bit fusty and outdated, doesn't it? Associated with, ancient thinkers, Aristotle, and it can feel a bit. And certainly, I'm not looking at virtue ethics in a way that we look down on young people and think, why aren't you behaving more virtuously? The society would be better if only children would behave more virtuously. It's more about looking at the institutions and the systems and the processes in our society and the extent to which they are generative of virtues or inhibitive of the development of good virtues. And also looking actually upwards at people in positions of power, whether that's CEOs of charities or politicians or celebrities or sports stars, and seeing whether we see this kind of behaviour on display. And unfortunately, in recent years, we've seen many, many examples of people in positions of power not behaving with these virtues. And it's a bit mean even to single out these people, because this slide could have been filled many times over, right? There are many, many examples of people in positions of power not behaving in line with virtues. And so in short, good societies are where we have high levels of human flourishing, so needs are well fulfilled, where there are high levels of subjective well-being, and where we develop virtuous behaviour. And that allows me to come on to the concept of social harm, which is what Hannah was referring to earlier. And I think this is a really, really important concept for making sense of the quality of life for children and young people. And this is a relatively simple definition of the term, I think. It refers to something that compromises human flourishing in a manner that could have been prevented. So it cuts against either need fulfilment or subjective well-being or the development of virtues. And unfortunately, in 2023 in the UK or in Britain, we have many, many different forms of social harm. These are some of them, and the book goes into detail on a whole range of social harms. You know, there are dozens and dozens, and I'm sure many people in the audience can think of many examples that aren't on this screen. One of the most prominent is child poverty. So children in the UK, it's between a quarter and a third of children who live in child poverty in the UK. Really high numbers, it's in the millions. And that obviously has clear potential to undermine need fulfilment, the need for security, the need for subsistence. It affects children's well-being, and I think it has some complex links to the development of virtues as well. And interestingly, I think ACEs, so adverse childhood experiences, from my perspective, would be one very important form of social harm, and a very prominent form of social harm, as Hannah was pointing out earlier. I think the statistics are quite stark. I think it's something like 8.5 million adults aged between 18 and 74 report being subject to some form of child abuse. 8.5 million, either physical, sexual or emotional child abuse. And about 4 million of those adults report being subject to or seeing domestic violence in the home. So this is a really high number, and it fits somewhere between child poverty and young people who are not in education, employment or training. And I think one of the important reasons for looking at social harms is that you see that they're very prevalent, and a way to improve child flourishing is to tackle these social harms. But for the purpose of the lecture this evening, I think whenever you discuss something like violence between young people, it's very, very important to contextualise that violence in the context of other forms of harm in their life. And so when we look at something like violence between young people, and we look at the statistics on that, it's around 0.2% of young people in a city like London who have action taken against them by the police, so they're charged, they're arrested, for something like violence with injury. And when you look at something like homicide, it's 0.0087%. So it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the youth population. So the vast, vast majority of young people are not involved in serious violence between each other, either as victims or as perpetrators. And I think that's so important because often we see reports of violence in the media day in, day out, and it's very, very easy to get a sense that the scale is much worse than it really is. We're all vulnerable to psychological biases like the law of small numbers, which means that when we see these things, we think that the scale is really bad, when in fact, when you look at the data overall, it's much lower than some of these other social harms. I think that's important. I'm not going to bore people to death with statistics and graphs, but there's a couple I want to go through before we get to the causes of violence and responses. This graph's really important, I think. It's comparing data from 2009-10 to 2019-20. And what it shows very clearly is that violence primarily is committed by men, and that hasn't changed since recorded statistics began, certainly hasn't changed in the last decade. But what has changed are the age profile of people committing acts of violence. So back in 2009-10, the majority of violence was committed by young people aged 24 and below. And we fast forward 10 years to 2020, the majority of violence is now being committed by adults. And I think that's very important because, again, violence tends to be associated with young people. We've even got a phrase for it, youth violence. We don't talk about adult violence, but we talk about youth violence as if it's a problem for young people. And yet, when you look at the statistics, most of our violence in society is committed now by adults. Another thing I think is really important to look at is this is a proxy for knife crime. So it's very difficult to get a really accurate indication of how bad knife crime is in society. But one of the good indicators is something like hospital admissions. This is assault by a sharp object, that's typically a knife. And when you look at where we are now, in 2022, in 2023, but the stats haven't changed much this year, we're not at an unprecedented level of knife crime. You wouldn't get that impression from reading a lot of media stories, because there's a sense in which we've got a feral group of youth who are carrying knives and out of control in a way that we've never seen before, and it's just simply not the case. If we go back through the data, even in the last couple of decades, we can see places where knife crime was worse than it is now. And so I think it's really important to keep a sense of that scale. It's important in part because if we think we're in a place that we've never been before, the temptation is to try and look for what is causing that massive uptick in violence that we've never seen before. So what's the new thing that's causing violence? And we often look at drill music, we often look at social media, or we look at zombie knives or whatever else it is. When actually, the causes of knife crime are usually quite continuous and consistent across time. And so there are things that were equally driving knife crime up back in 2006-07. That's the argument I'll be making in any case. Okay, so now we can come on to look at the causes of violence. which many people have spent their careers looking at and have written books on, and I need to cover in about 10 minutes, so I'll do my best. Elliot Curry, who's one of my favourite thinkers on this topic, is a professor in the States, has said that if we want to move towards violence-free societies, we need to pay careful attention to the social conditions that predictably breed violence. And these social conditions that I'm about to talk about also predictably breed a lot of the social harms, and in fact ACEs, that we were talking about earlier. And so let's go at this from one particular angle that I think is very useful, is to look at 4 entwined R's. So 2 of those R's are resources and recognition. And when I'm talking about resources, it's primarily wealth and income. So we've already had a proxy for that. Looking at child poverty, it's a relative measure, and there's relatively high levels of child poverty in our society. Lots of different statistics that can evidence the levels of wealth and income inequality in society. And they're all equally stark. One example is that the top 1% have approximately 230 times the wealth of the bottom 10%. So really, really, really unequal distribution of wealth and income in our country. And when you speak to people, I think generally everyone is okay with some level of wealth and income inequality. We all expect it to happen to a certain extent, because some of us pursue jobs that are going to attract more money than others. Some of us have talents, jobs that are going to pay better than others. Some people don't want to accrue a lot of wealth and income, and they take jobs because they enjoy the jobs and for whatever other reason. So a certain degree of wealth and income inequality is functional and desirable for any society. But when you speak to people, obviously on the political left, but even on the political right now, we've got to a stage of wealth and income inequality that I think many people see as really pernicious in many different ways. And even media outlets like the Financial Times, right? This isn't a bastion of leftist propaganda, right? The Financial Times talk about how unequal wealth and inequality has become in the UK. And one of the ways they've done that is to compare the UK to other countries like Slovenia. So Slovenia, a poorer country than the UK, lower levels of GDP. But the poorest in Slovenia are actually better off than a large proportion of the UK population, because our wealth and income distribution is so wide that our poorest are much worse off than the poorest in even countries like Slovenia, right? So big problems with wealth and inequality, wealth and income inequality. And one of the reasons that's particularly an issue is because it's tied to inequalities in recognition. And I'm using recognition here in the sense that political philosophers use it, in the sense of having a fundamental decency and respect attributed to people as human beings. And there are many different forms of misrecognition in society. 2 of the most prominent would be racism and class prejudice. If we take class prejudice, we live in a society where we're often exposed to messages about, we have a meritocracy. Implicitly or explicitly, we're told we live in a meritocracy, so people who amass great resources and wealth and income deserve it, and people who have little or nothing, it's because they haven't worked hard enough, they haven't aspired to have enough wealth and income. And I think there are two problems with that. It's unfair, and to an extent it's inaccurate. It's certainly not fully accurate. And there are different ways that come in at that. I think one would be to point out that a certain level of unemployment is built into the very fabric of our political economy. So when unemployment comes too low, it's said to be about 4 or 5%, then things like inflation will start going up. And we see the problems of high rates of inflation in society now. We're living through a cost of living crisis. So when unemployment drops too low, inflation goes up, and banks and central governments will take measures to bring inflation down. It's perfectly reasonable. We don't want to live in societies with high levels of inflation. We'll decrease state spending, we'll increase taxation, we'll increase interest rates. These are all things designed to suck money out of the system. So it'll bring inflation down, but it will take unemployment back up again. So there will always be a level of unemployment. It doesn't matter how hard everyone in society tries, you can strive and try as much as you want, there will always be a certain level of unemployment. And that kind of 4 or 5% is actually the equivalent of millions of people in the country. So that's one of the issues with saying that the unemployed, they just don't try hard enough. But the other thing is that even people on the margins of work now are often subject to fixed-term contracts, insecure contracts, and even if they're working full-time, they're on rates of pay that still leave them below the poverty line. And yet, the people out of work, the people on the in and out of work, unemployed, we kind of castigate them as drains on society, as these are people that we need to lambast for their lack of effort. And so you can see how tightly entwined resources are with recognition. And they're both magnetised upwards in society. So people at the top have lots of wealth and income, and they have most recognition, at least not subject to misrecognition. And that's accompanied by 2 R's that very much press down on populations. So those with the least amount of wealth and income are likely to be those who are subject to the most risk. And risk comes in all different forms. It comes in the form of unemployment or homelessness or temporary accommodation, of mental health problems, of health problems. We've just seen the COVID pandemic didn't hit society evenly. Very much certain populations were exposed to more risk, and this had to do with wealth and income inequality, and to do with things like overcrowding and the jobs that people have. But the point is that risk is not spread equally over society. People with lots of wealth and income can insulate themselves from lots of these risks. And that's accompanied by inequalities and state retribution as well. When you look across our criminal justice system, it's not a random sample of the population. It's very much filled with the people who have the lowest amount of wealth and income, who are most misrecognised, who are subject to the most risk. And all of these R's are entwined together, they're interconnected, and they make what Elliot Curry describes the social conditions that predictably breed violence. But the problem is there's a big gap here. I'm talking at a very macro level of these 4 R's, and I'm trying to explain a micro level behaviour, one young person committing an act of violence against another young person. So there's a huge bridge to have there. We need to find a way of bridging that gap. And that's where I think something like mattering comes in. So we've circled back to the concept of mattering that I think is crucially important. And the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that the circles have changed colour. They've gone from green to grey, and there's a slight shift in terminology. That's because mattering can be used to explain lots of different things in children and young people's lives, but this particular framing I think is the most useful. They refer to the same things though. So social significance is all about what I was trying to tell Finn about, that importance of relationships in someone's life. And I think many people, as I was going through those R's, might have recognised that when you're on the sharp end of those R's, it's very difficult to have lasting, high-quality relationships. So people who work in the public sector with young people, or maybe third sector youth workers, will recognise how difficult it is to make good, lasting relationships of a high quality with young people who are living in some of those conditions that I was just describing. And I think one of the relationships that is most fundamental to our lives, most foundational, is the relationship between a parent and a child, or a carer and a child. And I found out how difficult this relationship is over the past few years. It's incredibly demanding, emotionally, physically, psychologically. But when you have no access to wealth and income, and when you're subject to misrecognition and subject to high levels of risk and potentially levels of state retribution, that relationship is incredibly strained. And I've spoken to many adults, many children, through no lack of will, have found it incredibly difficult to have that good relationship. Parents working multiple shifts over different jobs, it's hard to be home when your children are home, or the psychological burden of being subject to such high levels of risk places a strain on you. It's very difficult to have good parent-child relationships under the best of circumstances. But when we have that very unequal distribution of R's across society, it undermines all sorts of relationships. And so we have lots of young people who are living with a sense that they're not socially significant, that they're not recognised by other people around them. That inequality in the R's also undermines something that's referred to here as agentic power. I think on the first slide it was adding value, but it's all about having goals in your life and wanting to make a difference, having a sense of agency. And it's really interesting because babies have this. You can see it in really early infants, where they'll, as soon as they can move their limbs, they'll try and move things around. And if they can do it, there's this sense of glee in their face and joy. They're so happy that they can do things. And they like to also interact with their parents, and when they smile at a parent, their parent smiles back at them. They're so joyful and gleeful at that. It's fantastic, and it's called the pleasure of being the cause. And then when they try and move something, if it's fixed down or if it's too heavy, they get so cross. You should just look out for this. They get so cross when they can't do something they think they should be able to do. Or when they're trying to get their parents' attention and their parents on their phone, there's a sense of horror, and that horror has been referred to as the trauma of failed influence. So even from a very early age, we have this yearning to matter, and I think it applies across the whole life course. We all have it. Babies, children, young people and adults. We all want to have a sense of social significance, and we all want to have a sense of agentic power. And there's been lots and lots of research on mattering that has shown that low levels of mattering amongst young people are linked to a higher propensity to suicidal ideation, to self-harm, and to violence against others. And interestingly, the links between a lack of mattering and self-harm are strongest in girls and young women, and the lack of mattering and violence against others is strongest in boys and young men. And there was someone called Lee Deemer who founded a project in Brixton called St Matthews, who captured the essence of mattering and its links to violence very nicely in a quote here, where he said there are young men literally dying to be someone or something, anything but no one or nothing. Young men literally dying to be someone or something, anything but no one or nothing. And I think many people who work with young men in this situation will recognise that quote and the resonance of it. They're dying to be someone or something. Anything but no one and nothing. And it raises the question, what are the specific links then between a lack of mattering and violence? Why is it that when children don't matter, they're more likely to commit violence? And I think there's at least two key things to talk about here. One is that when young people lack a sense of mattering, they're much more likely to put themselves into situations where violence is more likely. There are various examples of this, but one of the most obvious examples is when young people join a gang. Hannah's mentioned the problematic use of the term gang, but I'm going to use it for now. Essentially, it's often just a group of friends, right? But often when those friends engage in illicit activities on a regular basis, we call it a gang. So young people often join gangs to fill this kind of void of social significance. They don't have good relationships in their lives, and they're looking for that. And they get a sense of belonging from being in a gang around other people. They also are looking for a sense of agentic power. So when you're in a gang, you're often involved in things like robberies, carrying knives, you're involved in drug markets. And in various ways, that will give young people a sense of agentic power because they're making goals and they're achieving them. Whether that's in an antisocial way rather than a pro-social way, but it's young people aspiring to, for example, own the latest pair of Nike trainers if that's what's important to them, getting the money to do that and then buying them and having them. So it gives them a sense of power. But simultaneously, when young people are in gangs, they're then subject to much higher risk of violence, either as victims or as perpetrators. And so that's one way that a lack of mattering can link to high levels of violence. But we know that the majority of violence has nothing to do with gangs, nothing to do with drugs. Majority of violence, nothing to do with that. It's an important topic and it's a piece of the puzzle that I think is important. But vast majority of violence, nothing to do with drug markets or gangs. Most of the time, when young people are violent with one another, it's because of a trivial, or what I would perceive to be trivial, and many people in the audience would probably perceive to be trivial, instance of disrespect. You insult the person, or you insult their friend, or their girlfriend, or their family member. And most of us who have a solid sense of mattering and a sense of self-worth, that will sting, but we would brush it off, and it wouldn't hurt too much, and we would move past it. But when young people really lack a sense of mattering, and they have such a low self-esteem and sense of self-worth, those taunts and insults pierce a very fragile skin, and the reaction is such an emotional, violent, intense one that often young people are reaching for violence. And when you speak to young people about their particular acts of violence that they commit, in the immediacy just beforehand, or during or after, they almost certainly will tell you about the feeling of a rush and the feeling of having a sense of power or being the big man. In that particular moment, it gives them a sense of agentic power, that they've had a goal to achieve and they've achieved it. So those 4 R's and the unequal distribution of 4 R's are serving to undermine young people's sense of mattering. I think when we look across society now, we see a big swathe of young people who feel that they don't matter. And for those reasons of a lack of mattering and the link to violence, I think it's acting as a central driver of much of the violence that we're seeing in society, and it has done for a long time. Right? A lot of this isn't new. Okay. I now want to look at how it is that we try and keep society safe, how we keep young people safe. What are we doing to achieve that? And one of the things we're doing, and a good place to start, I think, is back in 2019, when the Home Office launched something called the Youth Endowment Fund. It's called the YEF. They gave the YEF £200 million to find out how it is that we can keep young people safe. So what do we do to keep young people safe? And they've created a toolkit. And here are some of the interventions that they recommend. So focused deterrence, hotspots policing, social skills training, A&E navigators. And they've spent a long time curating as much research as they possibly can, coming up with a list of interventions that really make a difference to keep young people safe. And I think they've done a very good job of bringing together a toolkit that is relatively user-friendly, it's understandable. You can, if someone's interested in piloting an intervention or running an intervention, you can go to the toolkit, you can see what seems to work, and you can do that. And the methodology behind that is, it's called randomised control trials. It's seen as the gold standard of evidence amongst many people. So you put police in a particular area, so there's violence in a particular area, put police there and see whether violence comes down. And then you compare that to other areas around the country and see whether violence is decreasing faster in that area with hotspots police. And if it is, then you conclude that there's the police that's responsible for that. But you need the control groups, right? So it's emulating a natural science experiment. They're trying to have control groups and treatment groups. And they do that for all of these different interventions. And if there are good randomised control trials that are in effect, then they very much promote them and they want that to be used to keep society safe. And so they end up producing something that looks like this. This is my depiction of the toolkit. It's a good toolkit. It's got lots of tools in. They're very well put together, they're numerous and varied, and if I was using the tools, I'd be happy with that toolkit. The problem is that the toolkit is trying to fix something like this. So this is my depiction of where we are in Britain in 2023. So we've just gone through a very long period of austerity. We've lived through a pandemic, and we're now in a cost of living crisis. Many of our public services are on their knees, so the health service is on its knees. Mental health services for young people are nowhere near where they need to be. The demand is way outstripping capacity. Our police service was cut to the bone. Yes, officer numbers are back to roughly where they were before, but you speak to anyone in the police, you can't strip away all that experience and fill it with a bunch of new recruits and expect the service to be where it was. Many different aspects of our criminal justice system are struggling. There are court backlogs and so on. Our education system, there's a teacher retention crisis. People often train for a while to be a teacher. They last a year or two and then they're gone. We're struggling to create good learning environments for students. Our social care system is crumbling. So all across society we're seeing some big problems, and kind of relates back to those social conditions that are predictably producing violence, and we're trying to make up for that using a toolkit. And at this point I've got to kind of underline 3 times and bold the fact that I'm not necessarily arguing against using a toolkit and these interventions. I actually think that given we're in the place that we're in, and there are young people who are in need, we absolutely do need to use some of these interventions. So I've spoken to people who work in the A&E navigators, for example, in different places, and I speak to police officers who very much favour focused deterrence, and I agree it can make a difference. So if we're in the position we're in, and we have young people at risk of violence, we should be doing these interventions, absolutely. We know that they work to a certain extent, for a short time period at least, so we should do some of these interventions, absolutely. But my argument is that we need to go way above and beyond simply implementing a toolkit of interventions to create safer societies for young people. And so what I think we need to do to move towards a violence-free society is ask the following of every policy that affects the lives of children and young people. We need to ask whether these policies will reduce or exacerbate inequalities across those 4 R's, across resources, across recognition, across risk and state retribution, across all of those policies. I think we need a fundamental review of all the policies that are existing, but certainly moving forward it's really important to use this policy lens for any policy that affects children and young people. The Youth Violence Commission published its report back in 2020, and we gave a list of concrete recommendations in each of these areas, so I'm not going to go into them in depth. But one thing I would say, going back to your book, Paul, Deb and Hannah, and your recommendation of trauma-informed approach across all services working with young people, is that is precisely the sort of thing that I think can make a big difference here in reducing inequalities across some of these R's. And that's why I was delighted to read your book and see that that was being promoted. And I'll support as much as I can, that being given some policy traction, because I think that's exactly the sort of thing we should be doing. And more broadly, as Hannah was talking about, the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies, it does a fantastic job of centering the voice of children and young people. And I think with something like a lens like this, in order to understand the impact of policies on children and young people, you have to speak to children and young people and hear their voices. And something this centre does, and the academics associated with the centre, is they are very, very good at listening. They're a global leader in listening to children and young people. People pay a lot of attention to what's coming out of this centre for ways to do research and pilot projects. And it's fantastic that that's happening. And I think even more broadly than the centre in Manchester, we've just been having a chat about Andy Burnham and Kate and the Manchester VRU, also champions for listening to children, young people and community voices, and I think that's absolutely central when we're doing something like this. And I'm sure actually many people here probably work in different capacities reducing inequalities in these 4 R's, so whether or not people recognise it explicitly as violence reduction work, I think that anyone who does anything to reduce inequalities in these 4 R's is implicitly helping to reduce violence between young people. I want to come at this just in one more angle, and it's to jump into the world of education for a second and think about how we improve our education system in schools. One way is to do what the YEF do, so you can pilot interventions and you can RCT them, but another way is to go and look at schools that do a fantastic job of producing great English results, great maths results, high-level pupils' well-being. You go and look at what those schools are doing, go and speak to the teachers, the head teachers, the children, the governors, look at the policies and practice and get underneath what is working well in those schools, and then look to spread best practice in that way. It's a very different approach. My argument is that we're doing nowhere near enough of this when it comes to violence reduction. Right, so let's put this model back into the sphere of violence reduction and look around the world, split up into many different nation states and countries, with very, very different levels of violence in them. We've got some countries with unbelievably high rates of violence, and we've got some countries that are practically little to no violence when it comes to serious violence in particular. And I wouldn't want to exaggerate where the UK is. We're a relatively low violence society compared to some places in the world, but there are many, many countries and cities that are much safer than our country and the cities in our country. And we should be looking to those countries to see what it is they're doing to keep young people safe. And when you look at those countries, they're very, very good at reducing inequalities in these 4 Rs. So they have relatively low wealth and income inequality. They have much lower levels of misrecognition. They subject their citizens to much lower levels of risk, strong welfare state, strong family supports, and they tend to have much lower levels of state retribution. They don't lock up people, they don't give people lots of criminal records. And so their societies look a bit more like this. And when you've got a society that looks like this, you have far less need for a toolkit, right? You might have a spanner lying around, but you don't really need to use a spanner when your social body, when your societal institutions are functioning well, and you don't have the social conditions that are predictably breeding violence. And my worry is that in future years, this is a genuine concern that I think this is the way we could be going, is that we're going to keep looking to countries that look a bit like, let's search long and hard for a car that looked worse than the one on the top, found it. This car represents countries like the US, where resources are even more unequally spread, where there are even bigger problems around misrecognition, where populations are exposed to much higher degrees of risk, their welfare state is even worse than ours, where state retribution is much higher, where we lock lots of people up and there's high levels of criminal records. And when you look at those countries, this is what you see. They've got a huge toolkit. Right? Countries like the US do loads and loads of these interventions. This is how they try and reduce violence in the US. They use those toolkits. But no matter how many times you run these interventions, you will never get down to the levels of safety and security for young people as the societies that manage to reduce inequalities in those 4 Rs. You thought I couldn't extend the metaphor any further, but I have. Here comes a rocket ship. Even those societies, I think, that are Lamborghini societies at the moment, need to be thinking about how they become rocket ships in the 21st century. Because we've got some massive, massive change around the corner in the form of the AI revolution that is coming. The timing and the nature of that change is not precisely certain now, but the impact will be huge. It will be this century. We've got huge population shifts that are going to occur as a result of long-term effects of climate change. We've got demographic shifts in the form of ageing populations and populations that are getting younger. Massive breakdown in the global order that was prevalent throughout the 20th century. So there are big changes on the horizon, and even those countries that are in good shape now are going to have to think very carefully about how they get to be a rocket ship. And I think the only way that we're going to do that, and the only way that we're going to create a society that is safe for children and young people, is through those sort of broad policy lenses that look about the inequalities in those 4 Rs. And that's why I promote it. I promote it because I think it will bring about declines in violence, but I also think it will tackle many of those social harms that I talked about at the start of the lecture, and it will be conducive to high levels of human flourishing. I think that's what we all want to see. I want to close just by paying tribute to Luke Billingham, who's the co-author to Against Youth Violence. He looks terrible up there. He looked a lot better on a really small laptop screen. I'm sorry, Luke. Lovely guy. Really smart guy. He wrote all the best bits of Against Youth Violence. And he wrote something called The Fire Analogy that I think kind of brings together lots of the ideas that I've been trying to promote throughout this talk. So I'm going to read from the slides, so forgive me for doing that, but I will end here. The accumulation over time of concentrated structural harms in particular places is like kindle, oxygen and heat, which sets these places alight. The communities most harmed by the policies, systems and institutions of this country are on fire. Some young people and families in these areas are better insulated from the flames, and the blaze will manifest differently between people, sparking creative brilliance in some but violent emotions in others. There's definite value in trying to work out how some young people stay safer from the fire than others, and there's clear worth in examining why the flames have differing effects on people. And it's certainly fruitful to both train more firefighters, so those who are supporting young people experiencing the most social harm, and to provide them with better equipment. I'm in favour of the interventions in the YEF model. I think that should be part of the solution. But the most substantial positive change would come from better addressing the source of the inferno, the incendiary socio-economic historical predicament which far too many children and young people find themselves in. it's on that note that I'd like to say, again, a huge thank you to the Centre for the invitation to speak this evening. Big congratulations, Paul, Deb and Hannah, for the book. It's an incredible book. I really hope it has the policy traction it deserves. And biggest thank you to everyone for turning up and listening tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings, and all the very best with your onward journeys.